A civil war reached its heights in the Patrian continent until the North made some inhuman experiments to turn people into incarnates and change the tide of the battle. Those experiments gave Hank Henriette the power of a godly mythical beast, enabling him to shapeshift into a werewolf and end the war. But as soon as the war ends, the country realizes they won't be able to control someone who has the power of a god. They decide his life holds no more value to them and shoot him with a god-killer bullet. A century ago, the settlers of Homeland, after founding a democratic nation, found themselves entangled in a conflict that divided the nation. The discovery of the mineral somnium triggered the split of Homeland into two rival factions, the industrial northern city and the mining southern city. The spark ignited the fuse of a civil war between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederation. Despite the numerical superiority of those from the South, the Northern Union had an ace up their sleeve, the Incarnates. These soldiers possessed the astonishing ability to transform into colossal mythical beasts, ruthlessly laying waste to their enemies. Emerged from the forbidden technological amalgamation of the Northern government, the Incarnates were practically deities on the battlefield, with imposing figures that foreshadowed the future of warfare. After a victorious battle, Captain Hank Henriette of the Incarnates encountered Elaine Bluelake and Kane Madhouse. Elaine, the mastermind behind the creation of the Incarnates, expressed concern as some soldiers were showing post-battle symptoms. She assured that she would resolve it soon, since they were her creation. Hank sought to console her, stating that everyone believed in her, especially himself. Elaine appreciated his kind words, and it seemed they were about to break the ice with a kiss. The captain remembered Kane's presence, rushed away embarrassed, and rejoined his other comrades. Although it didn't take long for them to pester him about the matter too, as apparently, everyone was aware of Hank's obvious interest in Elaine. Nevertheless, he managed to evade all questions, especially after Elaine approached the group and realized they were talking about her. The Incarnates continued to carry out missions under Elaine's constant medical supervision, while tension in the homeland escalated. Despite not having experienced any issues throughout all that time, one day, Abi, one of the embodied, loses control. After an intense battle, still in his bestial form, he attacks several soldiers, causing them agonizing deaths. Upon hearing the screams, his comrades rush to see what is happening and are horrified to find shattered soldiers and others poisoned. Hank approaches Abi dangerously, facing the toxic air, and asks him why he is carrying out such a massacre. Abi reacts to the voice of his captain, turning towards him to affirm that it is not him, begging him to stop. Hank shudders seeing Abi crying with his divided conscience. But before he can do anything, Abi is hit by a rain of cannonballs fired by the terrified military. After several hits, Abi falls to the ground in his human form, and Hank approaches him worried. Abi insists that it's not him, but something else. But his serious condition doesn't allow him to speak further. Despite the captain's desperate cries for medical help, the soldiers simply watch from afar, still filled with fear. Hank continues to insist on the need for a doctor, but Abi apologizes, and with tears he puts his hand into his mouth. Before Hank can stop him, Abi transforms his hand into his bestial form, causing his head to explode. Following this chaotic event, the other Incarnates are clearly affected by what happened, fearing ending up in the same way as Abi. After examining the body, Elaine comments that Abi had recently told her that upon transforming into an Incarnate, she found it difficult to distinguish her true identity, wondering if she could become human again. Although Abi said it was nothing serious at that moment, the doctor suggests that something must have happened since then, feeling deeply affected for not having been able to do anything. Kane asks if it's possible that the same thing could happen to everyone, but the doctor apologizes for not knowing exactly what might happen. At Abi's funeral, Hank tries to be transparent with his team of Incarnates, pointing out the possibility that what happened to Abi could happen to all of them. He assures them that, despite this, they are not animals, but beings with will and pride. He proposes an oath, stating that those who lose their souls will die at the hands of their own. If something similar happens again, they must stop it to ensure that their battles are not in vain. After numerous battles and the loss of many comrades, Hank gathers the Incarnates to thank them for facing such demanding missions. He informs them that within a day, they will finally capture the capital, facing their most intense battle. Seeing that his motivational words were not convincing his demoralized team, Hank decides to try something different and surprises the Incarnates by promising that, after the war, he will officially ask Elaine to go out with him. This declaration catches everyone's attention, taking them by surprise. Hank expresses his wish for everyone to celebrate with him and asks them to come back alive. It's enough for the Incarnates to regain their spirits and celebrate with renewed motivation to end the war once and for all. That night, Hank meticulously goes over the strategy for the next day in the company of Kane. The latter begs him not to constantly exert himself. However, Hank insists on doing his best, aware that despite being incarnated, survival has not been easy for them. Kane comments that they have come this far only thanks to his leadership, but Hank corrects that idea, pointing out that the credit goes to everyone who believed in him, including himself and the doctor, who contributed to Hank becoming captain. Kane smiles wistfully and asks if he remembers the day the three of them met. Hank nods, incredulous that two war orphans ended up being friends with a noble like Kane. Although remembering those times, Kane's smile fades, and he asks Hank to take care of Elaine, as she is overwhelmed and only he can help her. After the talk, the captain meets Elaine, who called him to talk. She reveals that the war will end soon, and that the operation the next day will probably be cancelled before it starts. Surprised, Hank listens as Elaine explains that headquarters has progressed in ceasefire negotiations, and the peace treaty is already complete. The country divided into North and South will be united again. Hank sighs in relief, saying they have finally achieved peace. However, Elaine adds somberly that they have no place in that peace, bewildering Hank. With tears in her eyes, Elaine suddenly turns and shoots Hank, causing him to fall paralyzed and in shock. Elaine claimed that those who became incarnates not only looked like monsters, but also lost their souls. She warned that this would happen to everyone, including Hank, driving them to madness and making them unable to control their powers. Despite her attempts to find a solution, Elaine was unsuccessful. Fearing that the loss of human souls would result in even more serious consequences than the war, she felt she had to take responsibility, as she was the creator of the Incarnates. Elaine approached Hank, embracing him while crying, expressing that she would soon follow him and regretting not telling him anything earlier, knowing that his kindness would make her hesitate. As she rose and wiped her tears, Kane arrived, and Elaine apologized to him for allowing him to help with something she had to face alone. She handed him a weapon with special bullets, planning to kill the entire squad without suffering, including themselves, to end the incarnate threat. However, unexpectedly, Kane shoots Elaine. As she fell to the ground, Hank was paralyzed, unable to do more than witness Elaine's death and Kane's hysterical laughter before losing consciousness. Upon awakening, a blonde woman, Second Lieutenant Liza Runecastle, briefed Hank that he was in the military hospital and had been in a coma for 2 months. The war had already ended, but Hank was distressed as he inquired about his squadron and Elaine. Liza revealed that Elaine had disappeared after they found him on the brink of death. The Incarnate squadron had disbanded. Kane had sent them home, but many had lost their sanity, causing chaos and fear in society. Liza questioned Hank about what had happened and the whereabouts of Kane, who had lost contact with them after the last battle. Filled with anger, Hank shouted Kane's name before launching a furious punch, destroying the wall and leaving Liza terrified. Over time, Hank starts dedicating himself to hunting the revenants, stumbling upon Edgar Beckford one day, a former comrade from the squadron. He emerged from the ruins of a building, carrying 2 sacks overflowing with stolen jewels. Edgar grinned wickedly upon seeing Hank, commenting that he had heard rumors that he was hunting down their comrades. As he observed Edgar's victim's corpse, Hank repeated the squadron oath, declaring that those who had lost their souls would die at the hands of their own. He then unleashed his attack against Edgar with an explosive spear, transforming into his werewolf form to bring the confrontation to an end. His next target was John William Bancroft, an incarnate who ran a local orphanage with his daughter. Despite being trapped in his beast form after the war, his enormous dragon figure didn't stop his daughter and the orphanage children from recognizing him and welcoming him with affection. John dedicated himself to improving the lives of the children by leveraging his incarnate condition. His daughter, Nancy Shaw Bancroft, managed the meager food supply as the orphanage relied on government funds. One night, while cutting costs, Nancy was frightened to see her father in a hysterical state, alarming the town and the children. As she rushed out, trying to calm him down, her father's screams became more frequent, disturbing the entire town. Soon, John Bancroft became a suspect in the mysterious disasters in the town. Despite seeing him as a hero, Nancy was told that it was safest to take the children away from the orphanage. Powerless, she watched as the crying children were taken to a safer place, and she returned to the house that was once filled with laughter and joy, now empty. That same night, she spoke sadly with her father, suggesting they move to a secluded house in the forest. Without a word, he walked away into the trees, leaving her alone. In the night, she heard an explosion in the forest, and worried about her father, ran through the trees to find him. Upon arrival, she found the captain next to her murdered father's body, who, having completed his objective, withdrew from the scene. After the girl fired her father a few days later, she left her home, recalling the image of the man in the white coat and swearing never to forgive him. With a rifle on her back and light baggage, she headed to the nearest town, asking everyone she met if they had seen someone like him. With no clues, Nancy became disheartened by evening, but just before giving up, she encountered Hank in a small-town restaurant. She knocked on the door forcefully, capturing everyone's attention. With eyes full of anger and trembling hands, she remembered her father and shot the captain directly in the chest. Despite this, Hank stood up as if nothing happened, ran towards her and took her in his arms, leaving everyone astonished. In a more secluded spot, he asks her who she is, and she reveals that she is John Bancroft's daughter. She questions how he survived the bullet, but Hank explains that a common bullet is not enough to finish them. The arrival of Daniel Price in the town puts Hank on alert, urging Nancy to stay still if she doesn't want to be in danger. Danny emerges as a giant, carrying a sack full of gold and blood-stained jewels, announcing that it is an exclusive gift for his mother in the town. Though terrified, Nancy's mother nervously thanks him, fearing to upset him. However, Hank approaches, accusing Danny of the attacks on the nearby wagons, ruthlessly destroying them. Furious, Danny demands to know who he is, but upon discovering Hank's identity, he immediately recognizes the oath they shared. Before Hank attacks, Nancy intervenes, questioning if he plans to kill him like her father and accusing him of lacking evidence. Danny interrupts, confessing that he attacked the wagons because they refused to hand over gold and jewels for his town. He launches an attack towards Nancy, but Hank moves her away in time. She watches in awe as Danny furiously strikes the ground, while the townspeople hide in fear. Hank reproaches Danny's selfishness and confronts him, dodging an attack before placing an explosive on his shoulder. The explosion knocks Danny down, and Hank approaches, pointing his gun, evoking memories of when Danny was still human and cared for his town. Danny's mother, restrained by the townspeople, cries from afar. Unexpectedly, Danny also starts to cry, asking his captain if they should have died like gods on the battlefield. Grieved, Hank decides to fire the special bullet that ends Danny's life. Danny's mother runs towards her son's body, devastated. Enraged, Nancy confronts Hank, asking him if he intends to kill more of his comrades. Hank defends the oath they made, but Nancy, aiming her rifle at him, asserts that the war is already over. Hank contradicts her, insisting that nothing has ended, as none of them could put an end to it. Confused, Nancy inquires about the Incarnate squad and her father's death. Faced with silence, she lowers the rifle and decides to accompany Hank in the quest for answers, determined to find out why her father had to die. Surprised by the young woman's determination, Hank agrees, and together they embark on a journey that will uncover the mysteries of the past in the coming days. The destination of this adventure is Rogue Hill, a town engulfed in persistent conflict, all because of a monster that took refuge in an imposing fortress. In this place, they encountered Liza, who detailed to Hank the story behind the gigantic structure at the heart of the city, created by the incarnate Minotaur. This extraordinary being was not only skilled with hands in construction, but also possessed superhuman strength, erecting the fortress in the blink of an eye, just in 3 days. Since its arrival after the war's end, the fortress had not stopped growing day by day. Liza explained that the havoc in the surrounding buildings was the work of the Minotaur, who, in his quest for materials for the fortress, left a trail of destruction behind. Over time, she warned, casualties in the population would increase. Hank received Liza's call to stop the monster as soon as possible, but Nancy, the daughter of an incarnate, burst in with a direct question. Was Hank planning to kill the Minotaur just because he was an incarnate? Amid Liza's confusion, the hunter clarified Nancy's situation. Angrily, suggested an alternative, to convince the Minotaur to stop instead of considering him a threat. Liza, though hopeful, was interrupted by the roar of the Minotaur atop his fortress, announcing the imminent conflict. Liza explained to Nancy that it was a daily routine, as the Minotaur did not cease his struggle, dragging the entire city along with him. Determined to act that night, Hank withdrew without further words. Disheartened, Nancy roamed through the ruined city, questioning why she had to face such a situation, remembering that the Minotaur had also fought to protect the people. Worried, Liza invited Nancy to follow her, leading her to a large refugee center. There, Liza revealed that it was the shelter for those with nowhere to go, victims of the fortress's construction that had taken away their homes. Nancy, seeing families in such desperate situations, remembered her father with tears. Liza reminded her that while peace was maintained thanks to the Incarnates, their primary duty was to protect the lives of the people. That night, Nancy made the decision to accompany Hank to the fortress. The scene became frightening as they ventured in, encountering the skeletons of soldiers who had once tried to enter but fell into the Minotaur's traps. Shocked by the sight, Nancy stepped back, tripping over a rock and accidentally triggering a deadly trap. Before tragedy struck, Hank saved her and instructed her to walk where he walked. As they progressed, Nancy, still trembling, inquired about the Minotaur's past. Hank shared that it used to be a fearful man named Theodore Sherman, who was afraid of everything and suffered from panic. Upon reaching an entrance, Hank asked Nancy to wait while he advanced. However, a mechanism was triggered when Hank crossed the entrance, causing a heavy wooden door to descend and block the path. Nancy was left outside, shouting for Hank to wait and expressing her desire to accompany him. At that moment, Liza appeared, revealing that Hank never intended to take Nancy with him. Liza had been following them all along with the intention of taking her back, fulfilling Hank's wish. Although Liza assured Nancy that she would protect her on the way back, Nancy didn't fully listen. Turning toward the closed door, Nancy insisted on following Hank, wanting to understand his actions. With anger and memories of her father, she expressed that she couldn't forgive what he did, but needed to understand what drove him to do what he was doing. While Nancy struggled futilely with the door, Liza, finally giving in, decided to help her. She activated a hidden button that unlocked the mechanism, allowing both to advance together into the unknown. Meanwhile, Hank found Theo in the center of the fortress, who joyfully recognized him and welcomed him. Theo proudly showed off the fortress he built, assuring that despite the squad's separation, they no longer had to fear the enemy. When Hank asked about the enemy's location, Theo replied that they were everywhere and coming to kill him, so he needed to make his fortress even bigger. Pointing his spear at Theo, Hank interrupted, stating it was time to end it. Theo became agitated and asked if Hank was betraying him. Unable to reason with him, Hank affirmed that yes, he was the enemy. Theo lost control, transforming into a Minotaur and exclaiming that an enemy had finally appeared. The battle began, but Hank focused on dodging the numerous traps Theo had set in the dungeon. When Nancy and Liza arrived, they saw Hank on the ground, with the Minotaur about to strike a massive stone axe upon him. Although Nancy was worried, Liza reassured her, stating that Hank would be fine. Theo attacked with his axe with all his might, but Hank gradually transformed into a werewolf. Liza explained to Nancy that Hank was one of the few incarnates who revealed his true power only at night. Nancy was surprised to see Hank's complete transformation and how he lunged at the Minotaur. After dodging many traps, Hank managed to inflict a severe wound, causing Theo to fall to the ground in his semi-human form. As Hank approached Theo in his human form, Theo recognized him again as his captain. More composed, he asked if he was going to die, and understanding the situation, said that he no longer needed to be afraid and felt good not having fear. Hank pointed his weapon at him, indicating that he could rest now. Despite Nancy's attempts to stop him, Theo peacefully closed his eyes, accepting his death. Hank fired, and Theo died with a smile. Seeing Hank's grim expression, Nancy recalled her father's death and wondered what he would have said at the moment of his passing. After a few exhausting days, we can finally see Nancy excitedly enjoying herself while traveling by train. A conductor, noticing her enthusiasm, approached and asked if it was her first time on board. Nancy nodded, explaining that her father had talked to her about trains, but she had never had the opportunity to ride one before. Shortly afterward, the conductor pointed out one of the most anticipated views of the journey, the imposing iron bridge that connected the northern and southern borders, being the largest on the continent. Built as a symbol of peace after the war, it linked the north and south, sustaining the peaceful lives of those who crossed it. Despite the moving story she was hearing, Nancy couldn't help but recall Hank's words, who had told her that the war was not over. Suddenly, the train came to a sudden stop, blocked by military forces that had closed the tracks. At that moment, Liza Runecastle entered the train looking for Hank, informing him that the incarnate giant was advancing at a great speed. In no time, They reached a military camp where Liza explained that the giant was moving eastward and threatening the crucial iron bridge in that direction. Hank revealed the difficulty of facing the giant, explaining that not even cannons caused him harm. Furthermore, any injury he received regenerated, making him more resistant. Despite the efforts of the armed forces, it seemed impossible to defeat him with the available military resources. However, Hank had a plan. After devising a strategy, everyone gathered to confront the beast. The military used cannons to distract the giant while Hank stealthily approached with his spear. He placed explosives on the joints, a weak point that rarely received attacks. The plan proved effective, and the giant fell to the ground in pain. The military celebrated and secured the giant to the ground to prevent it from moving. Meanwhile, Nancy was surprised to learn that, according to reports, the giant had not harmed anyone. Throughout the time, it avoided cities and towns, and even injured soldiers were not directly harmed by it. Liza suggested that it might still retain some of its humanity since there were no reported casualties caused by the giant at all. The next day, Nancy approaches the incarnate giant in an attempt to have a conversation. When the giant's eyes open, she is astonished and decides to introduce herself, mentioning that her father was John William Bancroft. She notices that she manages to capture the incarnate's attention for a brief moment and asks him the reason for heading east. Nancy tries to explain the importance of the bridge ahead on the path, suggesting that if he turns back, the army will stop bothering him. The giant lifts its head to look eastward, making it clear to Nancy that there is definitely something of interest in that direction. Meanwhile, Hank and Liza face complaints from the president of the railway company, who demands that they eliminate the monster once and for all before it destroys the bridge. Despite the protocols they must follow, Liza explains the organized strategy, but the president, angry, suggests the use of explosives, arguing that it's just an animal. He threatens to take matters into his own hands if the army does not act. Despite the president's anger, Hank stands firm on the plan, leading to his frustration and withdrawal along with his colleagues. During the preparations for the strategy, Nancy looks for the incarnate hunter to discuss the incarnate giant. Though she's convinced that Arthur Alston, the giant's name, holds something important in the East, Hank assures her he's a man of few words who never complained, no matter the mission. Nancy insists on the possibility of helping Arthur, but Hank, focused on the mission to eliminate him, doesn't relent. After a failed attempt to convince Hank, Nancy withdraws in tears. Liza finds Nancy later and explains how risky it would be to try to save Arthur due to his enormous size. Even if he poses no threat to the bridge, they would receive orders to eliminate him. According to Liza, the best course of action would be to try to prevent Arthur from suffering at the end. In the early morning, unable to sleep, Nancy gets up to speak with Arthur again. However, she is startled by a loud explosion. It turns out that the railroad president's accomplices attacked Arthur with a series of explosives, causing him to lose control and break free from the restraints holding him to the ground. In an attempt to defend himself, Arthur crushes those responsible for the explosion underfoot. Hank orders the soldiers to prepare the explosives, signaling a change of plans. They will eliminate Arthur immediately. Facing Arthur, Hank, using his werewolf form, manages to stop him and dodge his attempts to attack. After evading several attacks, Hank gets trapped under Arthur's foot, but with great strength, he makes him lose balance and crash against the cliff walls. When Hank gives the signal, the soldiers activate the explosives, causing rocks and debris to fall on Arthur. Despite the pain, Arthur continues to advance, rapidly bleeding. Nancy waits for him on the bridge, pleading for him to stop if he still retains his humanity. Hank also tries to talk to him, asking him not to destroy the new era of peace he helped create. When Arthur is just meters away from the bridge, another explosive goes off, revealing a wall of rocks that covered the path ahead and exposing the sea. At this sight, Arthur's eyes light up, filled with tears. Finally, Arthur falls to the ground, accepting his death. Shortly after, Hank tells Nancy that Arthur had mentioned in the past that he wanted to see the sea, even if just once. Although Hank feels disheartened for having killed him, Nancy encourages him, saying that thanks to him, Arthur's wish came true. This manages to make Hank smile shyly, and they return to the camp in better spirits. However, their mood changes drastically when Liza informs them that they have received a report. They have found a man fitting the description of Kane Madhouse. For that reason, they quickly head to the Steam City White Church, where numerous murders have taken place. When questioning the citizens, who belong to the military, they refuse to speak or assist. They don't manage to uncover anything until the next day when they find the corpse of another victim with similar injuries to the previous ones. Observing the parallel claws, Hank knows it's not Kane's doing. Shortly afterward, he discovers it is the incarnation of the gargoyle, named Christopher Keynes. That night, Hank confronts Christopher after being summoned by him to fight in an abandoned church. Upon arrival, he is disturbed to see bloodied corpses hanging from the ceiling. Christopher explains that he did it to show him the justice he administers, but this only angers Hank, who lunges at his opponent to attack. Using his werewolf form, Hank manages to face the gargoyle, but in a moment of distraction, he is intercepted and takes a strong blow. Despite gaining the upper hand, Hank is caught off guard when Christopher uses a pistol to fire a special God-killer bullet against the Incarnates that Kane granted him before the battle. Paralyzed, Hank falls to the ground, reverting to his human form, unable to do anything. However, Nancy appears, and while trying to protect a child, her life is threatened by Christopher. At that moment, Hank abruptly tears the bullet from his body, leaps quickly, and transforms back into a werewolf. With his hand, he pierces the gargoyle's chest, carrying him out of the church. When Nancy arrives at the scene, Hank had already shot Christopher in the head, putting an end to everything. Seeing the lifeless body, she can't help but cry, asking why all the Incarnates have to end this way. Hank sadly responds that the power of an Incarnate is too great for one person. He then collapses on the ground, still injured from the gunshot. Nancy rushes to help him but is soon stopped by resilient spiderwebs. Kane appears, echoing Hank's words, saying that the power of the Incarnates is too great, so everything is possible. Hank angrily shouts, and Kane mocks him for receiving a second God-killer bullet. Despite the girl's attempts to move, the spiderwebs prevent her, and shortly afterward, she falls unconscious from Arachne's toxin. Kane then reveals that he only wanted to extend an invitation, handing Hank an envelope with an address, and saying that if he promises to go, he will return Nancy. Unable to resist, Hank collapses unconscious, watching as Kane takes away his young companion. On the next evening, after recovering, Hank didn't hesitate to head to the address specified in the invitation. The venue was a vast mansion filled with nobles and privileged individuals, all of whom turned their attention to Kane as he made his entrance. He thanked his guests for being present, asserting that they shared a broad vision of the world and agreed with his ideals. Kane explained that the majority of the country was being deceived by fleeting happiness, while the government manipulated reality. It imposed its ideas about war, fueling discord between the South and the North, arguing that the war should never have ended. The crowd disagreed, and Kane insisted on the need for a different order than the government's, something they could achieve through everyone's contributions. Suddenly, a crowd of reincarnated beasts burst into the hall, leaving those present astonished. However, amazement turned to horror when one of them killed a man with impressive ease. Amidst the silence, Kane smiled, declaring that he no longer needed any of those present. The Incarnates began to attack, sowing chaos as people ran for their lives, while Hank would do his best to stop this massacre. The extermination team, led by Claude Withers, the president's son, arrives just in time to confront the beasts. Claude, spotting Kane, becomes furious and orders an attack. While the squad battles the Incarnates, the army leader advances towards Kane, threatening to end his life. However, two powerful Incarnates surround Claude and launch an attack. Displaying agility and aided by a jet thruster on his back, Claude manages to evade most of the attacks. Protected by his squad, Hank attempts to reach the villain, but encounters resistance from the two formidable Incarnates. Kane's excitement fades as Claude, armed with a special bazooka, fires a cannonball that obliterates his stomach. Capitalizing on the opportunity, Hank leaps, hurling his weapon to pierce Kane's face, causing an explosion that bisects his body. However, spectators witness Kane swiftly returning to normal, rapidly healing his wounds. Kane then invites Hank to join forces, but faced with refusal, he decides to exploit Nancy, taken by one of his accomplices. Pointing a gun at Nancy, Kane vows to eliminate all that binds him. Before Hank can rush to her rescue, he is ensnared with spiderwebs, forced to witness the unfolding tragedy. Kane taunts him, promising a reprisal of a previously witnessed scene, and ultimately shoots Nancy. As she falls, memories of Elaine's death overwhelm Hank, shattering his sanity, precisely what Kane desires. In a startling transformation, Hank loses control and morphs into a colossal wolf, dubbed by Kane as the King of Beasts. After the chaos, Claude learns that Hank has disappeared, just like Kane, and shortly afterward, he is astonished to see the state of the city. In no time, news of the devastation of Whitechurch spreads and impacts the people. Later on, Kane takes the initiative to prepare his own nation against the North, calling it a new homeland and declaring its independence. On her part, Nancy manages to survive the gunshot, solely because the bullet got trapped in the dress she was wearing, seemingly made from a fabric created with the thread of an incarnate. After recovering and undergoing a lengthy interrogation, the girl decides to return home after a long 6 months to lay flowers on her father's grave, recalling everything she did up to that moment. Still uncertain about what to do with Hank, after witnessing firsthand the burden carried by the Incarnates. Upon returning to the town, Nancy is surprised to see Liza, who is also thrilled to see her, and explains that she is there with some troops of soldiers led by Claude due to the sighting of a nearby Incarnate. Upon hearing this, the young woman decides to accompany the squad, thanks to Liza convincing Major Claude. That night, they decided to camp in the forest, and shortly afterward, they heard the heavy footsteps of an Incarnate. However, upon seeing the Incarnate, Nancy is terrified to realize that it is her father. Not understanding anything, our protagonist approaches dangerously to see him and notices that his flesh is rotting, crumbling into pieces. Nevertheless, she tries to speak to him, futilely attempting to reason with him. Claude protects her from an unexpected attack from the dragon, and shortly afterward, the squad opens fire on him. The Incarnate, unaffected by the bullets, walks away into the forest without further ado. Claude orders not to pursue him, as with that firepower, they wouldn't be able to harm him. Therefore, they return to the camp and quickly begin to devise a strategy to eliminate the Incarnate. While Nancy waits somewhat disheartened, Liza approaches and asks her if she would like to return to the village. However, the young woman insists that they have to face whatever comes without fleeing, as that is what her father would want. Liza then hands her a small case, saying that in that case, she would need this. Upon inspecting the contents of the case, Nancy is surprised to see 14 bullets kill Incarnates for her rifle. Liza assures her that they don't know what could happen, so it's better for her to have them just in case. Later that night, the squad confronts the dragon, but despite managing to tie it up, it loses control and launches an attack that sets it free. As the Incarnate begins to run, it falls into countless traps they left behind, but shortly after, it decides to fly away. Seeing the beast flying towards the village, Claude orders Liza and Nancy to take care of evacuating the people while they pursue the dragon. Claude uses a bazooka to destroy one of the wings of the Incarnate, causing it to crash to the ground. Soon, the Incarnate reaches the village crawling, and upon seeing the lives of the people in danger, Nancy remembers her father when he was human. Liza is surprised when Nancy runs up to the dragon, pointing her rifle at it. Nancy finally understands why Hank does what he does. It's to protect the wishes of everyone from when they were still human. Claude watches from a distance, surprised to see Nancy firing several bullets at the creature that used to be her father. Our young girl cries with each shot, until she finally manages to make it stop moving and fall to the ground. In tears, Nancy drops her rifle, surprised when her father makes a gesture he used to make, showing a last trace of humanity before crumbling into 1,000 pieces. Afterward, a bit more composed, Nancy tells Liza that she was finally able to say goodbye to her father. Despite now understanding what Hank does, she can't help but wonder if there's another way to save them without them having to die. Nancy asks to join them on their mission to find Hank, and Claude allows it since having her nearby when they find Hank will be beneficial for them. Meanwhile, the Northern President, Richard Withers, orders the extermination of the Incarnates within 3 months, and the generals wonder why the president is in such a hurry. They claim it's the president's way of saving the nation using his son Claude as a political pawn. Soldiers are camped on the seaside, awaiting the supply ship, and Claude is frustrated as they will have to wait for days before the ship arrives. Nancy is admiring the ocean view, lost in thoughts about Hank, when she hears a melodic singing. She follows the sound and enters a cave where she encounters an incarnate mermaid named Trice. While enjoying the music, a man named Charles holds her at gunpoint and instructs her to leave and forget what she saw. However, Trice tells him to leave the girl alone. She reveals to the mermaid that she is Will's daughter, and they sit down to talk. Charles apologizes to her and asserts that due to government orders to kill Incarnates, he wants to protect Trice from the townsfolk and the governor. The bounty on her head will make people turn her in and fear her as well. Charles tells her that Trice used to work at his bar as a singer, which excites Nancy as she is talking to a singer. But Trice tells her that it's all in the past. Trice explains that due to the war, at some point, everyone stopped appreciating her singing, and when she enlisted in the army, she used her voice to kill people. But when they returned, people celebrated, yet still looked at them like monsters, and no one wanted to hear a monster sing. So she hid until Charles finally found her. Trice expresses her desire to end her hiding, to which Charles is opposed, But Nancy tells him she would like to see her again and talk to her. Our young protagonist keeps her promise and visits Trice every day, bringing gifts and some items. Nancy talks to her about Hank, and Trice expresses her wish to sing in front of a crowd again. Nancy assures her that day will come soon. After this, she returns to the camp but encounters Claude, who warns her not to wander around as the townsfolk distrust the soldiers. Claude reveals that Cain is his older brother, and it is his duty to kill him, as well as Hank and other incarnates. Charles stands before the townsfolk, eager to uncover his secrets, but manages to escape despite being shot. Later, he goes to see Trice, who confesses her desire to leave the city and sing again someday. Charles advises her to run as the townspeople are searching for her. On the verge of exhaling her last breath, he tells her not to blame them, as they are simply afraid of the future. Later that night, Trice returns to the city, singing a melody that lulls those who hear it into a deep sleep. Claude, informed by Lisa that Trice is responsible for this strange phenomenon, orders his men to locate her. They find Trice singing by a fountain, and those enchanted by her song fall asleep while Claude tries to resist. At that moment, Nancy appears and asks Trice why she's hurting people. Trice argues that she's saving them from a painful future. Nancy notices that Trice is not acting like herself and manages to return her to normal. Claude shoots Trice, who flies away as Nancy pursues her. Trice reaches Charles's burned-down bar, and Nancy catches up with her. The mermaid confesses that she can no longer sing on the stage she once loved because people see her as a monster. She asks Nancy if she would like to hear her sing, and Nancy responds that she would be delighted. Just as Trice is about to start singing, soldiers interrupt with gunfire. Claude orders them to finish off Trice, but later tells them to stop when Nancy approaches her. Our young protagonist begins to sing, and Claude is about to order them to shoot, but she assures him that the song is different. Trice tells Nancy that it's okay, and in her final moment, she performs a song that our protagonist admits was beautiful. When she finishes singing, Trice dies. The next day, one of the ships had arrived, and they were preparing to set sail. Claude meets Nancy and informs her that they have found Hank in the Central Mountains. However, he warns her that the next time she interferes, they will shoot her. Nancy explains that she wanted to save Trice because, despite recently meeting, they had become friends. Meanwhile, Hank was fulfilling his oath, but he couldn't transform into a wolf as memories invaded his mind. The incarnate he was fighting, named Vic, tries to kill him. Despite his injuries, Hank manages to finish him off using the bomb lance. The blood trails led Garm, Roy's incarnation, straight to him. Garm attacked him immediately, questioning why he kept rejecting Cain's invitation. Roy explained that he had been ordered to kill him if he couldn't convince him, but seeing that Hank wouldn't yield, they both began to fight. Weakened, Hank threw an explosive to distract Roy and managed to disappear from his sight. However, Garm sensed his concern and found him behind a tree, delivering an attack that left him severely injured. Claude's squad arrived at the mountain, and Nancy couldn't stop worrying, as the target to eliminate was Hank. When dawn broke, Roy stopped chasing Hank, choosing not to kill him without a fight in his werewolf form first. Meanwhile, the squad investigated the area, but Claude collapsed from a high fever. Upon waking up, Nancy took care of him, assuring him that squads had been sent in all directions. Hours later, a squad returned, reporting that they had seen Hank Henriette and another unidentified incarnate. After a strategic meeting, Sergeant Gerald Corlani took on the mission, persuading Claude to stay in the cabin due to his condition. Meanwhile, Roy tortured Hank with repeated blows, trying to force him to transform into a werewolf. Eventually, he succeeded, bringing him to the brink of death and triggering memories of Nancy, who in his mind had died as Elaine. In his werewolf form and filled with rage, Hank relentlessly attacked Roy until his eye filled with blood, remembering the disaster of White Church. Hank let out a heart-wrenching scream that the squad managed to hear from afar. Roy was disappointed to see Hank reverting to his human form, slamming him to the ground repeatedly in anger. Before Roy could finish off Hank, the squad appeared, attacking without restraint. Roy responded to the attacks, dodging any attempts directed at him. While dodging a bazooka shot, the cannon caused the cliff on which Hank was standing to collapse, as Nancy helplessly watched the situation unfold, unable to do anything about it. Sometime later, while the squad is battling Roy, Hank awakens in a cave alongside Nancy, who is immensely relieved to see that he is alive. Confused, Hank asks where he is, but seconds later, he is surprised to see Nancy in front of him. After Nancy explains what happened, Hank smiles in relief, saying that the fact that she is alive is his only salvation now. With a somewhat sad expression, Nancy also recounts what happened with her father in their village, leaving him shocked. She confesses that she finally understood what he probably felt when he shot his father, and says she wanted to make sure to tell him that if she ever saw him again. Despite that, Hank doubts that they will truly forgive him and breaks down thinking about everything he did, saying that to fulfill the oath they made, he killed comrades who only wanted to live. Remembering them all, he wonders if he truly has the right to that. After all, he is increasingly losing himself by using his powers, and he is nothing more than a beast now. Hank then approaches Nancy with a somber expression and asks if she can kill him, as he at least wants to die remembering what his comrades were like. Shocked, Nancy cannot say anything, and Hank is surprised to see her cry, realizing what he has done. Therefore, he apologizes to her before leaving the cave, saying that he has to settle things with Roy. Before leaving, she tells Nancy that she has one request, that none of them be forgotten by her. Hank emerges from the cave, and after a while he finds Roy severely weakened from the squad's attacks. He walks towards him, taunting him to approach, with the intention of triggering an explosive that would end them both. With no plans for what comes next, Hank decides to end it all in that moment. But just before taking Roy's life, Hank is surprised to see Nancy stepping in and using her rifle to shoot Roy. Nancy reminds Hank of his humanity and assures him that if he truly becomes a beast, she will take care of killing him when that happens. With tears in her eyes, she promises to do so while he is still human, so he can remember them all. Nancy declares that it's her oath, and as she shoots Roy, she asks Hank to keep hunting down his comrades who have lost their souls while they are still human, and to survive as long as he can. After a moment of great surprise, Hank smiles, impressed that Nancy said all that, despite being just a girl. Finally, he drops the grenade, and just as Roy lunges towards Nancy, Hank steps between them, transforming into a werewolf to strike him with great force and send him flying. Shortly after, Claude and his squad arrive, witnessing both of them fighting violently until ultimately, Hank crashes Roy into a tree, piercing his chest with his own fist. Returning to his human form, Hank puts an end to Roy's life using a bullet kill incarnate. Nancy appears beside him afterward, asking him what Roy was like before, with the intention of being able to remember him. Meanwhile, we can observe them torturing the incarnate scout, forcing him to speak about his former comrades and reveal everything he knows about them. However, they are interrupted by Colonel Gerald, who informs Claude that they have received a direct order from the president to proceed immediately to Bold Creek to participate in the attack on the fortress of New Homeland. Additionally, he added that they had confirmed the presence of Kane Madhouse in the fort. Although Claude was not pleased with the decision, he took the initiative to bring Hank on the mission, ensuring that he wore the squadron uniform to avoid raising suspicions about his incarnate condition. Once at the Northern Army front, they were welcomed by Colonel Martin Wall, who would lead the capture mission. Wall explained that they had faced numerous challenges on their way to the fortress, even sending reconnaissance units and scouts without getting close enough. The situation became even more complicated as a sniper, Miles Byron, nicknamed the Incarnate Centaur, eliminated their men from a distance with nothing more than a bow and arrows. Hank informed the colonel about Miles Byron's exceptional skill, describing him as an extremely skilled and swift sniper. Faced with this revelation, Hank suggested that attacking with small forces would be futile, as the Incarnate would easily eliminate their men with his bow. The colonel, surprised by the precision of Claude's squadron information, consulted Hank on the best strategy to follow. Hank confidently asserted that there was only one viable option, a night assault that would serve as bait to lure Miles Byron out. According to Hank, the sniper would not hesitate to leave his hiding place during the darkness of the night, instilling fear among enemy ranks. Following Hank's master plan, that same night, Miles approached the squadron. The darkness prevented him from using his bow effectively, so he was forced to fight hand-to-hand. After brutally dispatching the first soldier, the rest of the squadron scattered in panic, but Miles pursued them, enjoying every moment as he eliminated several soldiers in his path. Hank intervened surprisingly, transforming into a werewolf, but Miles blocked his attacks with ease. After a brief exchange, Hank ran, and Miles chased him, eventually falling into a trap skillfully prepared by the squadron. A hail of bullets caused Miles to collapse, but to everyone's amazement, he got up, regenerating his wounds instantly, claiming to have become much stronger since the war. Despite the constant gunfire, Miles retreated as if nothing had happened, returning to the fort to inform Kane about Hank's presence in the area. Satisfied, Kane gave the order for the next move. The next morning, soldiers built trenches and positioned artillery since the incarnate centaur did not attack again. After a full day of preparation, the army was ready for the assault the following day. When the colonel gave the order, Hank and the soldiers leaped onto the battlefield until sunset. Not finding enemies in sight, Hank wondered about Miles's whereabouts. However, Miles appeared ruthlessly attacking soldiers from their hiding spots. Miles fell into the squad's trap, managing to bring him down, giving Hank the opportunity to place an explosive on his arm. Although Miles's arm was shattered, he rose, laughing hysterically as he regenerated. With Hank's hair turning white, he warned Miles that his soul was shattered, initiating an intense battle. Colonel Martin watches alongside Claude and the other soldiers from afar, witnessing how Hank bravely confronts the Crimson Stronghold. When Hank finally manages to immobilize the adversary on the ground, he signals the colonel and steps aside. In response, the colonel gives the order, and the army opens fire, aiming at Miles, shattering a significant part of his body. Despite that, Miles laughs as he regenerates, commenting that it did hurt, but reminding Hank that he is immortal. Hank aims his weapon at Miles, who defiantly urges him to shoot. However, within seconds, a purple mist begins to surround Miles, undoing his body quickly and painfully. Hank is surprised to witness this and avoids breathing the toxic air, recalling the similar effect that Abby's poison had. Several soldiers die instantly, and Hank warns the survivors to avoid touching the mist. Quickly, the rest of the soldiers retreat. In the distance, Liza is horrified to witness the scene, while Colonel Martin appears satisfied, stating that the plan went as intended. Claude, furious, asks the colonel what that was, and he explains that it is a new weapon developed by studying Abby's corpse, the incarnate Hydra. Even more angered, Claude points out that no method of attack should require so many sacrifices. However, the colonel defends himself, saying they are not on a hunt but at war. He looks back at the battlefield, expressing his wish that Hank had also been trapped in the mist. Miles's body slowly tears apart, causing him great pain, but he never stops laughing. Hank finally ends his suffering with a bullet kill incarnate and leaves the scene. Meanwhile, in the military camp, a massive number of soldiers suddenly die, causing great shock. A soldier rushes to inform Claude of what has happened, but his head suddenly explodes in front of him, revealing the presence of Kane. Claude urgently orders Nancy to hide, and she runs without hesitation. Colonel Martin looks disdainfully at Kane and remarks that he has quite the confidence to show up in person. With a signal, he calls for a row of soldiers, despite Claude's attempts to warn him that it won't work. However, the colonel orders them to open fire. Bullets pierce through Kane, who seconds later, with a simple hand movement, annihilates the row of soldiers. The colonel becomes enraged and orders the grenadier soldiers to attack, but Kane suddenly disappears. He reappears behind a soldier, possesses him, and makes him attack his own comrades. In the midst of the chaos, a grenade falls, causing an explosion that draws the attention of the soldiers trying to take the fort. Hank entrusts Sergeant Gerald with guarding the fort and hurries towards the explosion, worried about Nancy. Kane murders Colonel Martin, administering the same toxin he used to kill Miles, claiming that using it is playing dirty. Claude confronts him with a special sword that can harm him, but Kane tries to possess him. However, he is suddenly saved by Hank, who tears off his enemy's arm with his spear and shoots him with his weapon. Kane disappears before the bullet reaches him and reappears elsewhere with his arm restored. Seeing Claude on the ground, Hank tells Nancy to take care of him and asks Kane what he is doing there. Soon, Hank realizes that it was all a distraction, and the powerful enemy exclaims that they will soon form an alliance with the South, confessing that he was fixing some things while they were busy on the battlefield. Claude says that's impossible since the South is supposed to remain neutral, but Kane informs him that the Southern leaders they were dealing with at that moment must be corpses regretting their decisions. Surprised, Claude angrily declares that it's not an alliance, but an invasion. Kane says he will change the balance of power in the world, but Hank assures him that he will stop him. However, he tries to explain that humans are not much different from beasts after seeing what they did to Miles. Failing to reach an agreement with our protagonist, they both begin to fight, and despite Hank using his werewolf form, he fails to inflict any damage, unlike Kane, who easily hurts him and distracts him by creating countless clones of himself. As the battle in the fortress progresses, Hank's strength decreases, and he returns to his human form when the sun rises. Kane delivers a fatal blow to Hank and asks him one last time to join him, calling him the King of Beasts. Seeing Nancy worried in the distance, Hank remembers the time she told him that he is still human and that he must continue hunting down those comrades who lost their souls. The sparkle returns to his eyes as he remembers everything, so Hank rises with difficulty. But just as he is about to fall, Nancy catches him in her arms. Kane becomes extremely enraged, stating that she's just a human, and upon recalling Elaine, he completely loses control. When he's about to strike Nancy, Hank steps in, effortlessly blocking the attack using a new type of power. His hair shines white again, and for the first time that day, he unleashes his beast power. A devastating power that manages to defeat Kane in a matter of seconds. After finally rendering Kane unconscious, Hank releases his power, collapsing to the ground, prompting Nancy to run to him with concern. Both are surprised to hear Kane laughing on the ground, despite being defeated. Fascinated, Kane remarks that the King of Beasts' power far surpasses that of the Incarnates. He then teleports behind them, but upon seeing that the North managed to take the fortress, he says it's time for him to leave. Kane bids farewell to both, assuring them that he will see them again. The North managed to avoid the imminent attack on its capital, but the Free Nation of New Kane Madhouse took control of the West and South, becoming the strongest nation in Patria. Upon learning this, President Richard Withers of the Northern Union of Patria declared a state of emergency and called all forces back. Hank and Nancy embarked on their journey together, aiming to fulfill their oaths. Meanwhile, as a final scene, Kane is shown talking to Elaine, who is in a coma in a capsule. Kane holds a somnium mineral and tells Elaine that the new world she once tried to kill has finally arrived. And thus, the first season of this anime comes to an end. The end! Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get new anime recaps.